Hello everybody and welcome back to the Listen Lang Gang. This week we wanted to give you a podcast to help you in your progress towards English language, and as we are all in lockdown at the moment, I am going to record a quick podcast for you on my top tips to help you with writing a question 5 for language paper 1.
Cracking conversation, analytical interpretation, and igniting imagination with the Listen Lang Gang.
So hi everybody, this is Miss Graham and I'm going to be talking you through my top 5 tips for a question 5. Now before I get started, I just wanted to say that there are numerous different ways that you can go about writing a question 5, and this is by no means a holy grail and will absolutely get you those top marks. However, this is my advice for pushing you towards those top marks, and I think if you follow these 5 tips, you're actually going to end up writing something that could be very, very good. Now, also I need to note that these are very individualistic. It depends on your writing style, and of course it also depends on which task you pick. These tasks, or these top tips even, are all for those of you who are going to be doing the story task as opposed to the descriptive task. The picture, the description, has a separate set of skills which we may go over in a later podcast. However, this is aimed at students getting top 7s, 8s and 9s on the story, which in my personal opinion is the harder of the two tasks. The main reason for it being harder is because it is a narrative structure as opposed to a descriptive structure. And when you think about it in those terms, a description need only be that, a description. But a narrative implies you need to have character development, you need to have plot development, you need to have a plot arc, you might even need to have a reveal. So actually there are more steps that you need to go through in order to write a good story. I sometimes fear that kids go for the story task because they think it's going to be more interesting, and in many respects it is more interesting to write a story than it is to write a description. However, my only worry with that is that writing that story is harder, and it actually, when done, let's say in a weaker sense, can actually inhibit your grades much more than a weaker description. So I'm going to talk you through these in turn, and hopefully you will find these useful as you move forward. Okay, so my first top tip is actually just to write everything down. Now, we talk to you a lot about planning your response and making sure that you have got a good idea of where you want to go before you actually put pen to paper and start writing it. That's also, of course, true for any kind of piece of writing you do, be that a paper 2 as well. But my advice when coming up with a story idea is to get every idea you could possibly have down on that paper, even the rubbish ones. Because what you do when you put pen to paper, you expel it from your mind. So if you see, and I'm going to use an example throughout each of these tips so that you can see the consistency. And I'm going to give you the example of write a story where time plays an important role. Okay, let's imagine that is the task you've been given. Well, if you write every idea down on paper, including the bad ones, then actually what you're doing is you're just getting those out of your mind and freeing up space for you to think a little bit more creatively. I will talk about how you be a little bit more creative in my next point, okay? But when we take an idea where time plays an important role, well, a lot of kids will go time, and they'll go very sort of meta, and they'll go exams are time conditions. I'm going to write a story about someone writing an exam. Now, when we look at that on the outset, I'll be honest with you, that's a pretty boring story, and examiners don't want to read that. That's dull, that's not interesting. You've jumped at the first idea. But by writing it down on the paper, you've got it out of your mind, allowing you to be a little bit more creative and think about other ideas where time is actually very important. So get everything down on that paper, every idea you've got, any idea where time might vaguely come up, and then I would start to cross out the ones that you know you're never going to do. So, for example, exams. Another example I give for this that I would cross out instantly is time travel. Again, a lot of children kind of go for that kind of time, would go down the time travel route here. But this will lead me on to another point. That's going to be quite hard to do in the time that you've got. So it'd just be another one that I'd cross out. And then I'd look through the ideas I've got remaining and pick the one that I think will ultimately give me the best story that I can write. Okay, and tip number 2 brings me on to that point of saying, well, how do you come up with a good story? My view on it is it should involve emotion over action. And all I mean by that is an emotional story will be better in an exam condition than an action story. By that I mean you can get everything you need out of a story that is emotionally fraught and actually very little happening. So if we take an example of write a story where time plays an important role, think about an emotional moment where time would be significant, where you're perhaps waiting for something. So again, this might be something very somber, like maybe as a lot of kids would do, waiting for someone to die. That's this really somber idea. But again, you can see now that's better than time travel. That's better than an exam already. Equally, it could be someone counting down the clock to some big event that's going to happen, and it doesn't have to be death. It could be counting down the clock until like maybe a woman who would like to have a child and she's counting down the time on a pregnancy test, or maybe it's someone counting down the time on a clock to the moment their exam results are released and all the emotions that they're experiencing. What I'm saying here is these are emotional stories, and they are actually better, in my opinion, than a huge massive fight scene with this action and that action, because ultimately you are going to be jumping from idea to idea to idea to idea, and you're really going to struggle to flesh out one bit of action enough for it to actually be a good story. So just to reiterate, my second point is to put importance on emotion over action in these stories. And tip 3 is a really simple one. And if you've been listening to the previous two, then I've already started to allude towards it. It's keep it simple. You don't want a story with this happening and that happening and this happening and then finally ending here. Because if you think about it, we advise you spend 45 minutes on this question, 5 minutes planning, 35 minutes writing, and 5 minutes proofreading. And if you have got a super intense story with lots going on, my question would be, how are you going to do that story justice in the time that you have got? That's why originally I said, as much as time travel might make a really interesting story for a story where time plays an important role, how are you going to do time travel in 35 minutes? Because if you think about the events you would need to go through in order for that story to work, you would need to go through character development at the beginning before the time travel. Then you would need to do the time traveling in time, whether that's backwards or forwards. Then you would need to be at the location where they have travelled to and let something happen there. And then potentially, if you want to carry on, that's enough. That's already too much, let alone if you want to then travel back and maybe something has altered where you came from. All of this combined, you just sort of realise, do you know what? I would be spending sort of 5 minutes a section, and that's really not going to be long enough. So keep it simple. And that's what I mean. Emotional stories have a much bigger impact. So as opposed to you jumping about here, there and everywhere in time travel, well, write about that story with someone in hospital who's watching the clock nervously until the time for an operation, or someone coming back from an operation and thinking about the happy times. If you think about it in terms of what's happening in that story, nothing's happening. Absolutely nothing's happening. This is a person sitting in a room and thinking, but the emotional story is really significant, and you don't have to worry about explaining how they got from there to there to there and jumping it about too much, because your story is internal. It's inside someone. It's their thoughts and feelings. There is a good reason why I come back to this idea of time, because I've read quite a few really good ones with regard to this. And a few years ago I had a student in my class write a story where time plays an important role, and it was about a woman sitting in a bed, and she was looking at the walls and they were painted blue and pink, and she looked out the window and it was all very emotional, and she saw a tree cradling its branches and cradling its leaves. And I thought, this is really beautiful description. And I was reading the story of this woman, and she was clearly very upset. And then at the end, there was the reveal that she was actually waiting for IVF treatment to become a mother. And so then when you look back and go, there's your reveal, what an emotional impact that has. And you realise that all of the stuff that this student was writing, the blue and the pink on the walls, the tree cradling the branches, it all linked with motherhood and being and children. So actually it worked perfectly, and it was a fantastic story. And the story was a woman sitting in a bed. So you see, keep it simple, emotion over action, and you end up with a much better story. For my fourth tip is a writing structure this time round. And you might have heard us talk about this because we've been talking about it quite a bit recently. And this is resolution flashback. Now, this is a way that you can structure your story and actually have a really good, well, I've said it, structure to your whole piece. So what I mean by that is when we are doing writing, we often talk about Freytag's pyramid, where you go through certain stages in a story for it to have a really good impact. So that might be the exposition at the beginning, then the conflict, the rising action, the climax, the falling action, and then you end on the resolution. What we are arguing here is why not start with the resolution? Why not start at the end of your story? So tell me what has happened at the end, but be a little bit vague about it. So an example that we have in the answer booklets that we give out to you is of a woman sitting in her car crying and clutching the steering wheel and feeling all of this emotional upset. Then the story goes into a flashback. So we go back into the past and we see this woman, who is a mother, packing up her daughter to move to university. And we talk about them putting the boxes into the car and the feeling of it and them driving to the university. It's got loads of things in that which are good, but I won't go into that. Then they hug, they say goodbye, and the story ends with the mother in the car crying as she drives away. But it's bittersweet because she's crying, but she's feeling really proud of her daughter, that she's gone to university and she's going to go on to this amazing life. What we've done there is we've created a clear structure. We've clearly thought about this in advance, so the exam board will be like, okay, this is interesting. We've included a flashback, which we know is a structural technique because you went back to the beginning after that opening paragraph. But what you've also done is created a cyclical structure because you've gone back to where you started. So it's got that to it as well. However, if you're subtle with it as well, you can use that cyclical structure, go back to where it started, but change it slightly. So at the beginning, we had a woman in the car crying. We felt her heartbreak, and at the end it's no different, except we get that sense of pride. So it is a little bit different. At the beginning we might be thinking, oh my gosh, who's died? Why is she so upset? What's going on? Who's she left behind? And at the end we go, we know who she's left behind, and these are tears of pride, as well as her own sadness. She's happy about what her daughter's doing. So you can see it has, again, emotion over action. No real storyline here, it's just an emotional story. But we've gone back to where it started, and it's simply just going resolution and then flashback, and then you end up back at the resolution. Honestly, I can't think of any reason why you wouldn't structure your stories this way now, considering everything it gives you. And lastly, tip 5. And this is one that is really important if you want to get your examiner's attention, and that is be original. Don't do the generic story. I mean, it kind of lends into tip 1 when I said write it all down. If you are writing the same story as everyone else, it's going to get boring, and examiners don't want to be bored. They have read hundreds of papers by the time they get to yours, and they have heard that story a million times over. So what are you going to do to grab their attention? What are you going to do to be different that will make your story stand out over the others? So in that story of write a story where time plays an important role, they've heard a million stories about someone waiting to die. I know it sounds emotional, and I know I mentioned it earlier as an idea, but they have also read that sort of 100 times before they get to yours. And I only say that with experience, having set this for year 11s a few years ago. I set them this question to see what they did with it, and I read a lot of stories about death, and it got not only really depressing for me, but it got a bit samey, and ultimately they didn't have the emotional impact that they thought they might, because everyone had written it. So what are you going to do to be different? What are you going to do to show your examiner that you aren't like everyone else? You're capable of coming up with an original idea that is not only emotional and will have the impact you want, but is also engaging and just actually interesting. And that's what it comes down to a lot with these stories. I say they're a bit of a risk if you want to get high grades. I think, yeah, they kind of are, because I think you're very capable of getting top grades, but if they're done badly, then they tend to be done pretty badly. And a lot of the times when they're done badly, it's just because they're boring. And I know that sounds almost harsh in a sense to say that they're boring, but they are. The best stories are emotional and they have that impact, but they're different. So just think about, what are you going to do to get their attention? They've been marking for hours. They are bored. your story's on their desk, how are you going to keep it in their mind? Okay, hopefully you found those tips helpful in some way. Obviously you might use some, you might use all, but either way I would highly suggest you consider using these the next time you write a question 5, so that actually you're going to end up writing a better story out the other side of it. Hopefully you didn't miss the conversation too much. Sadly, we are of course also in lockdown, so I can't see Mr. Grimmett, Miss Batiste, Miss Johnson, Miss Gray, all the people that normally appear on the podcast, but hopefully we'll be able to organise some sort of virtual chat for us all soon so that you can still pick up with us there. Take care, and we hope to see you very soon. Bye guys.
Little Night Gang.